He did not lose a war. He did not abandon his people. He did not wake up one morning and decide to rebel against God. He simply won, again and again and again. The kingdom had never been stronger. The walls stood taller. The armies marched in disciplined ranks. The markets were full. Mothers slept without fear. His name was spoken with admiration in distant lands. They called him chosen. They called him favored. They called him blessed. And at first, he trembled when they said it. But something subtle began to shift. It was not loud. It was not obvious. It did not look like evil. It looked like confidence. It sounded like gratitude mixed with certainty. It felt like destiny settling comfortably on his shoulders. After all, had he not prayed before every battle? Had he not rebuilt what others destroyed? Had he not honored God in the early days? Success can feel like confirmation. Victory can feel like approval. Influence can feel like ownership. And that is where the danger hides. Because there is a line, invisible, holy, ancient, a boundary drawn not by men, but by God. A line between being entrusted with glory and attempting to possess it. On the day he crossed that line, no enemy army stood outside the gates. No assassin waited in the shadows. The threat was not in the battlefield. It was in his heart. This is the story of a king who began on his knees and ended in silence. A story about power, blessing, and the quiet moment when gratitude turns into entitlement. And it begins at the height of his success. Before the king was crowned, before the banners were lifted, before the people ever whispered his name with hope, the kingdom was already breaking. It did not collapse in a single night. It eroded. The previous ruler had not been a monster. He had not burned cities or slaughtered his own people. His failure was slower than that. More respectable. More polished. He compromised. He made alliances that seemed wise at the time. He tolerated influences that should have been removed. He allowed foreign customs to mingle with sacred traditions. He told himself it was diplomacy. He told himself it was progress. But compromise is rarely loud. It moves quietly through policy, through conversation, through convenience. And slowly, the center weakens. The armies grew undisciplined. The courts grew corrupt. The priests grew divided. The people still attended festivals. They still sang the old songs. But reverence thinned. Ritual remained. Fear of God faded. Then came the humiliation. A neighboring power, once restrained by strength and unity, tested the border. The king responded with pride instead of prayer. Advisors warned him to wait. He did not. The battle was short. The defeat was not. The walls were breached. The treasury plundered. The sacred vessels, symbols of divine favor, carried away like trophies. The people did not riot. They whispered. Whispers are more dangerous than riots. He no longer listens. He trusts himself too much. God has withdrawn his hand. The king survived the war, but he did not survive the shame. Conspiracy formed in quiet rooms. Deals were made in low voices. Loyalty dissolved. One night, he fled the capital under cover of darkness. He never returned. By the time news reached the city that he had been killed in exile, grief did not fill the streets. Relief did. But relief does not build stability. The throne stood empty. An empty throne is not neutral. It is a magnet. Generals saw opportunity. Nobles calculated outcomes. Priests feared fragmentation. The kingdom stood at a fragile edge. Too weak for division. Too wounded for another war. And that was when someone spoke the unthinkable. There is the boy. The room fell silent. He was 16. 16 is an age for training, not ruling. For listening, not commanding. For learning the weight of a sword, not carrying the weight of a nation. But he was of royal blood. Legitimate. Uncompromised by the previous administration's scandals. Untouched by military disgrace. Young enough to shape. Old enough to present. It was not ideal. It was necessary. The boy had been kept away from politics. His mother, cautious and perceptive, had shielded him from court intrigue. He was educated in history, in law, in sacred writings. He had been taught not only how kings ruled, but why. He had watched his father's decline in silence. He had seen what pride did to a man. When they told him he would be crowned, he did not celebrate. He went to the temple, not to claim authority, not to announce destiny, to kneel. He was afraid. Fear, when directed properly, is wisdom. The coronation was restrained. No extravagant displays. No overwhelming spectacle. The kingdom could not afford illusion. When the crown touched his head, It felt heavier than he imagined. He did not smile widely. He did not wave grandly. He bowed, and the people noticed. The first months were quiet, deliberate. He asked questions instead of issuing decrees. He summoned experienced leaders and listened more than he spoke. Some interpreted this as weakness. Others recognized it as restraint. He sought out an elderly prophet who had long withdrawn from court life during the previous king's compromises. The prophet had been ignored when correction was inconvenient. Now he was invited back. The young king would sit across from him for hours. What failed? Where did we drift? What did we assume that we should have feared? These were not questions of arrogance. They were questions of survival. Under counsel, the king began rebuilding, not with grand gestures, but with fundamentals. The army was reorganized, not expanded wildly, but disciplined. Corrupt officers removed. Merit restored. The courts were audited. Judges who took bribes quietly replaced. The temple purified. Foreign influences dismantled. Sacred practices reinstated, not theatrically, but faithfully. He did not declare himself reformer. He practiced it. And something shifted. The neighboring powers tested again. This time, the king did not rush. He prayed. He consulted. He prepared. When battle came, it was strategic, not emotional. The victory was decisive. The people did not shout his name first. They shouted gratitude to God. And the king publicly agreed. In the early days, he was careful with praise. When ambassadors congratulated him, he redirected honor upward. When generals credited his leadership, he emphasized unity. It felt sincere, because it was. The treasury slowly refilled. Trade routes reopened. Farmers returned to secure fields. The city gates closed at night without panic. Stability is not dramatic. It is quiet. But quiet safety is addictive. The young king grew into his role. His voice deepened. His posture steadied. He learned when to be firm and when to wait. And the people began to admire him, not merely as a placeholder, but as a leader. He was not flamboyant. He was effective. He invested in infrastructure, strengthened the outer walls, reinforced watchtowers, dug new water systems in the wilderness so that sieges would not cripple the capital again. He thought long-term. Merchants praised his economic foresight. Soldiers respected his discipline. Priests appreciated his deference to sacred order. The kingdom flourished. And for a time, everything aligned. Blessing followed obedience. Victory followed prayer. Strength followed humility. It was the kind of leadership story that makes historians generous. But prosperity has a hidden property. It amplifies whatever already exists inside a person. In the beginning, humility was amplified. Soon, influence would be. And somewhere beneath gratitude, beneath responsibility, beneath righteous reform, something else began to grow. It did not appear in speeches. It did not manifest in laws. It lived in thought. A quiet recognition. I am doing well. Not sinful. Not yet. But dangerous, if left unguarded. Because broken kingdoms test courage. But restored kingdoms test character. And the real trial had not yet begun. The first change did not happen in public. It happened in a room with no witnesses. The king stood alone before the polished bronze mirror, fastening the royal clasp across his chest. The gold caught the torchlight and scattered it across the stone walls like fractured stars. He studied his reflection longer than usual. Not in vanity, in validation. He had carried the weight of responsibility for years. He had fasted before battles. He had wept for his people. He had slept on cold floors when plague struck the villages. He had done the hard things, the holy things. Surely confidence was not a sin. Surely strength was not rebellion. Surely leadership required certainty. That was how it began, not with defiance, but with justification. At council meetings, he no longer asked, "What does the Lord say?" He asked, "What is the most strategic move?" It sounded wise. It sounded efficient. It sounded like maturity. But something invisible was shifting beneath the surface. The prophet still visited the palace. The scrolls were still read in the courtyard. Offerings were still burned on the altar. Yet prayers slowly moved from dependence to ritual. The king still prayed before war, but now it was shorter. More formal. Less desperate. Desperation had once kept him humble. Now security had made him composed. And composition can become distance. Success changes the temperature of the soul. There is something about prolonged success that rewires the human heart. When battles are constant, you cling to God because you must. When peace is constant, You assume stability because you earned it. The kingdom prospered beyond expectation. Trade routes expanded. Foreign dignitaries arrived with tribute. His name spread across deserts and seas. People did not just respect him. They admired him. Admiration is dangerous. It feeds quietly. It does not attack like an enemy. It wraps around you like a cloak. Servants began announcing him with louder voices. Generals bowed lower. Citizens cheered longer. At first, he waved them off. Later, he waited for it. He told himself it was for morale, for unity, for the kingdom. But inside, something was warming to the sound of his own greatness. Not loudly, just enough. The moment of subtle independence. The crisis came unexpectedly, not from invasion, but from opportunity. A neighboring territory fell into chaos. Their king died without an heir. The land was rich, strategic, and vulnerable. The council gathered. This is the moment, one advisor urged. We can secure our borders forever. The general nodded. Our army is unmatched. We could take it in days. All eyes turned to the king. In earlier years, he would have dismissed the room and gone alone to seek God. He would have waited, fasted, asked for clarity. This time, he did not dismiss them. He listened to the arguments. They were strong arguments. He knew the scriptures about expansion, about blessing, about inheritance. He could quote them. He could interpret them. And in his mind, he merged divine promise with personal ambition so smoothly he no longer saw the difference. We move at dawn, he declared. No thunder cracked. No prophet interrupted. No angel blocked the gates. Sometimes God allows silence. The campaign was swift, efficient, brilliantly executed. The land fell. The people were subdued. The treasury overflowed. Celebration erupted in the capital. The king stood on the palace balcony overlooking a sea of cheering citizens. Torches blazed like stars beneath him. Music thundered. His name echoed through the streets. He raised his hands. And for the first time in years, he did not immediately lift his eyes toward heaven. When God is no longer the first thought. It was small, barely noticeable, but heaven notices small shifts. The next morning, the prophet arrived unannounced. He did not bow deeply. He did not smile. You did not ask, the prophet said quietly. The king stiffened. We secured peace. You secured power. Power preserves peace. Not when it replaces obedience. The words stung, not because they were loud, but because they were precise. The king felt irritation rise in his chest. Irritation was new. In the past, correction had produced repentance. Now it produced defense. Have I not served faithfully? He replied. Have I not honored God in every victory? You honored him when you needed him, the prophet said. Now you trust what he gave you more than the one who gave it. Silence filled the chamber. The king's jaw tightened. The prophet left without another word. And something hardened inside the king that day. Rationalization, the final step before pride. He replayed the conversation in his mind repeatedly. Was it wrong to act decisively? Was it wrong to protect his nation? Was it wrong to use wisdom? No, of course not. But pride rarely announces itself as pride. It presents itself as responsibility, as leadership, as inevitability. He began to avoid the prophet's counsel. Not openly, but gradually. He delayed meetings, delegated spiritual oversight to priests, reduced personal time in prayer. He still believed in God. He just no longer felt urgent dependence. Dependence had been replaced with experience. Experience had been replaced with control. Control had been replaced with quiet self-reliance. And self-reliance, left unchecked, becomes self-exaltation. The second warning. The warning did not come through words this time. It came through unease. Despite prosperity, sleep became restless. Despite expansion, peace felt thinner. Victories felt less satisfying. There is a strange emptiness that follows ambition fulfilled without surrender. He walked alone through the newly conquered territory months later. The land was fertile, the rivers wide, the cities rebuilt under his banner. Yet he sensed resistance, not rebellion from people, but dissonance in his spirit. He entered a former temple dedicated to foreign gods. It had been emptied and repurposed as a treasury. As he stood in the silent hall, the echo of his own footsteps unnerved him. A thought surfaced, unwanted, sharp. Did I build this, or did God? The answer should have been simple, but it did not feel simple anymore. The turning point within. Back in the capital, construction began on a monument, a officially dedicated to the unity of the kingdom. Unofficially, it bore his likeness. He justified it as inspiration, as national pride. But Stone remembers intentions. During the dedication ceremony, crowds gathered again. Trumpets sounded. Priests offered blessings. The king stepped forward to address the people. He began with gratitude, speaking of God's faithfulness, of divine favor. But midway through the speech, something shifted in his tone. "We have built," he declared. "We have secured. We have expanded." The language was subtle, but heaven heard the pronoun change. A sudden wind tore through the courtyard. Torches flickered violently. The sky darkened without warning. The crowd fell silent. The king's voice faltered. For a moment, just a moment, fear pierced through his confidence. He felt small again. He felt exposed. He felt the weight of the invisible line he had crossed. And in that instant, he had a choice. To step back, to kneel, to publicly repent, or to press forward and preserve his image. The silence stretched. Thousands waited, and the king chose strength over surrender. He finished the speech. The wind died down. The ceremony concluded. But something sacred had withdrawn. When glory departs quietly, the kingdom did not collapse overnight. There was no immediate plague, no instant exile. That is what made it more dangerous. Life continued. Prosperity remained. But presence faded. Prayer became hollow. Worship felt distant. Decisions grew sharper, more aggressive. Criticism was less tolerated. Loyal advisors were replaced by agreeable ones. A leader who once trembled before God now guarded his reputation more fiercely than his obedience. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the atmosphere of the kingdom changed. Peace felt thinner. Joy felt staged. Success felt heavier. The king had not abandoned God outright. He had simply taken the credit that belonged to him. And that is often enough. The tragedy was not that he failed once. The tragedy was that he stopped listening when he was warned. Because the most dangerous moment in a leader's life is not defeat. It is sustained success without humility. And the storm that would eventually break over his reign was not punishment for ambition. It was the inevitable consequence of forgetting who truly sits on the throne. The silence did not announce itself. It settled, like dust, like fog creeping through valleys at dawn. At first, no one could name it. The kingdom still functioned. Trade still flowed. Armies still trained in disciplined formations. The monument still stood tall in the capital square, sunlight glinting off carved stone. But something intangible had shifted. The king felt it most in the mornings. There was a time when he would rise before the sun and kneel by the eastern window. He would watch light spill across the hills and whisper prayers not out of duty, but hunger. Those prayers once felt alive, like conversation, like guidance flowing both ways. Now they felt rehearsed. He spoke. He waited. Nothing pressed back. No clarity. No correction. No warmth. Just air. He told himself it was exhaustion. Leadership fatigue. The burden of responsibility. After all, he carried a nation. But deep down, he remembered what presence felt like. And this was not it. The cracks began to show. The first visible crack came from within the army. A general, loyal for decades, questioned a new strategy. Not publicly, but privately, respectfully. In earlier years, the king would have listened, weighed counsel carefully, asked whether pride was blinding him. This time, he heard only challenge. "You doubt my judgment?" he asked, voice cool. "I fear we are expanding too quickly," the general replied. "Our borders are stretched. Our soldiers are tired." The king dismissed him from the room. Days later, the general was reassigned to a distant post. Not as punishment officially, but as removal. When insecurity replaces humility, dissent feels like betrayal. And insecurity had begun to whisper louder than conviction. Control becomes an idol. The king began tightening systems. New laws, stricter oversight, increased surveillance, all framed as protection. But control rarely stops where it begins. Advisors who once spoke freely now measured every word. Priests sensed distance in the throne room. The prophet had not been invited back in months. Meanwhile, the monument became a symbol. Children were brought to see it. Songs were written about unity under one ruler. The king's image appeared more frequently in public art. He noticed. He did not object. And with each passing week, his internal justification grew stronger. If the kingdom prospers, then surely God approves. That is the most dangerous equation a leader can make. Confusing outcome with obedience. A private confrontation. One evening, long after the palace corridors emptied, the prophet returned. Unannounced. Older now. Slower. But eyes still sharp. Guards hesitated but allowed him through. Something about him still carried weight. He found the king alone, studying maps by torchlight. "You feel it," the prophet said softly. The king did not look up. "Feel what?" "The distance." Silence. "The kingdom thrives," the king replied evenly. "The kingdom functions," the prophet corrected. "Thriving is different." The king's jaw tightened again. That familiar tension between conviction and defense. "Are you here to accuse me?" he asked. "I am here to remind you." The prophet stepped closer. "You were strongest when you feared losing God more than losing power. Now you fear losing power more than losing God." The words landed heavy. For a fleeting second, something inside the king cracked, a memory of who he used to be. The young leader who trembled before battle, who fasted in secret, who wept openly when corrected. He could return. Even now. He could kneel. He could confess publicly that ambition had outrun obedience. History might remember him not for expansion, but for humility restored. But pride rarely collapses in one dramatic moment. It resists quietly. "I have done nothing unlawful," he said finally. The prophet's voice lowered. "Not all rebellion looks like lawlessness. Sometimes it looks like self-sufficiency." And with that, he left. Again, the withdrawing of protection. Months passed. Then the drought came. At first, it seemed seasonal. A dry cycle. Crops suffered, but not catastrophically. Then wells began to thin. Rivers narrowed. Farmers grew anxious. The priests prayed for rain. The king ordered irrigation projects, engineers, resource reallocations. Practical solutions. Necessary solutions. But heaven remained closed. In private, the king returned to the eastern window. He knelt. But the prayer felt different this time. Not intimate. Not surrendered. Desperate. "Send rain," he whispered. No answer. Days later, unrest sparked in outer provinces. Nothing violent yet, just murmurs. Frustration. Questions about leadership priorities. He tightened enforcement. The tighter he gripped, the more fragile the kingdom felt. The mirror moment. One night, unable to sleep, the king wandered alone through the palace hall. He stopped before the great monument, a smaller replica installed inside the royal chamber. Torchlight flickered across carved stone. He stared at his own likeness. Once, he would have recoiled at such a thing. Now it stood unquestioned. He studied the face sculpted in stone, strong, resolute, victorious. It looked nothing like the man standing before it now, because beneath the crown and robe was fear. Not fear of enemies. Fear of irrelevance. Fear of losing control. Fear that if he admitted wrong, everything would unravel. And there it was. The truth he had been avoiding. He had not pursued expansion for peace alone. He had pursued it because power feels permanent, and dependence feels fragile. But power without presence is hollow. The kingdom could survive drought. It could survive unrest. What it could not survive was a leader spiritually disconnected. The edge of collapse. The next morning, reports arrived. A border tribe had refused tribute. Minor, but symbolic. The council waited for command. The old king would have paused. Sought counsel. Sought God. The current king felt only urgency to reassert dominance. "Prepare the army," he ordered. And as generals dispersed to carry out commands, thunder rolled faintly in the distance. Not rain, just warning. Because sometimes the final collapse is not sudden. It is cumulative. A series of small choices that compound until correction becomes consequence. The silence from heaven was not absence. It was invitation. An invitation to return. But pride interprets silence as permission. And if he did not turn soon, the kingdom he fought so hard to build would begin unraveling from the inside out. Not because God desired destruction, but because no throne can remain steady when the one who sits on it forgets who truly reigns above. The army marched at dawn, not because invasion was necessary, because authority had been questioned. The tribe at the border was small, poorly armed, no real threat to the throne. But their refusal to send tribute carried something more dangerous than weapons. It carried defiance. And defiance, to a king fighting internal insecurity, feels intolerable. The generals sensed the imbalance. This was not strategy. This was demonstration. But no one spoke. They had learned. A victory that felt empty. The campaign lasted less than a week. There was no glorious battle. No epic resistance, just swift suppression. Homes burned, leaders captured, tribute re-established. The king returned to the capital expecting relief. Instead, he felt nothing. No satisfaction, no surge of confidence, just a heavier silence pressing against his chest. When you fight the wrong battle, even winning feels hollow. Reports began circulating quietly among the people. Whispers of harshness, of unnecessary force, of a king who no longer resembled the shepherd leader they once admired. Publicly, loyalty remained. Privately, trust eroded. And trust, once fractured, does not shatter loudly. It thins. The drought deepens. The skies remained iron. Fields cracked under relentless sun. Livestock weakened. Grain reserves dipped lower than projections. The engineers worked tirelessly. Reservoirs were rationed. Distribution tightened. The king held council after council, adjusting policies, issuing decrees, calculating solutions. But the prophet's earlier words echoed relentlessly. You were strongest when you feared losing God more than losing power. He had feared rebellion more than distance. And now distance had produced unrest anyway. The breaking point in the palace. One evening, news arrived that shook the court. A city within the newly conquered territory had revolted. Not violently yet, but publicly. They tore down the king's banner from the city gate. Not because they hated the kingdom, because they resented the force that brought them under it. The council erupted in debate. Send reinforcements immediately. Negotiate. Make an example. All eyes turned to the throne. The king felt the familiar heat rising, the instinct to dominate the situation before it spread. But something else rose with it. Fatigue. Not physical exhaustion. Soul weariness. He dismissed the council. Alone in the chamber, he finally allowed himself to sit without posture, without composure, without performance. And in that stillness, a realization surfaced like something long submerged. He had spent months fighting external threats that were symptoms of an internal fracture. The drought, the unrest, the resistance. They were not random. They were reflections. The night of reckoning. He walked again to the eastern window. The hills beyond the capital were brown now. Once green slopes, now brittle under drought. He knelt. But this time, he did not ask for rain. He did not ask for victory. He did not ask for stability. He asked one question. When did I lose you? Silence lingered. Then memory answered. Not an audible voice, but clarity. You did not lose me. You replaced me. Tears came without ceremony. He saw it fully now. The moment he chose strategy over surrender. The speech where pronouns shifted from you to we. The monument built under the banner of unity, but fueled by ego. The tightening grip on control. The dismissal of correction. None of it had seemed catastrophic individually. But together, they formed a throne within his own heart. And he had been sitting on it. The hardest decision. Repentance for a private man is difficult. Repentance for a king is terrifying. To admit failure publicly risks weakness. To confess pride risks legitimacy. But to remain silent risks collapse. At dawn, he summoned the council. They entered expecting military commands. Instead, they found a king without royal robe. Without crown. Bareheaded. Barefoot. I have led from strength, he began slowly. But not always from obedience. The room froze. I sought to secure what God entrusted to me. And in doing so, I trusted my own hand more than his. Shock rippled through the chamber. A ruler admitting fault was unprecedented. I will not send troops to the city, he continued. I will go myself. Not with an army. With humility. The public undoing. Word spread quickly. The king traveled to the revolting city not with banners or soldiers, but with a small escort. No trumpets. No spectacle. When he arrived at the gates, the same gates where his banner had been torn down, he did not demand it be restored. He stood before the gathered citizens and removed his signet ring, a symbol of authority. I expanded too quickly, he said plainly, and I ruled you before I understood you. No threats, no force. I asked forgiveness. Silence blanketed the crowd. Some wept. Others stared in disbelief. Because power rarely bows. But when it does, it reshapes everything. The first drop. That evening, as he returned to the capital, clouds gathered faintly along the horizon. No storm. Not yet. But possibility. Back at the palace, he ordered the monument altered, not destroyed, but reshaped. His likeness removed. Replaced with a simple inscription. Entrusted, not entitled. The prophet returned days later. No rebuke this time. Only a quiet nod. You remember, he said. And that was the beginning. Because the fall had not been a single catastrophic collapse. It had been drift. And restoration would not be instant either. But the throne within his heart had shifted again. And when the heart realigns, the kingdom often follows. Repentance did not end the drought overnight. That was the part no one talks about. We love stories where humility triggers instant miracles, where confession unlocks immediate rain, where one right prayer reverses months of consequences. But restoration is rarely dramatic. It is deliberate. The king returned to the eastern window every morning, not to ask for outcomes, but to rebuild intimacy. The prayers were quieter now, shorter, less strategic, more honest. I don't want the throne in my heart anymore, he whispered one dawn. Only yours. The unrest in the outer provinces did not disappear in a single decree. Trust had to be rebuilt through action. Policies softened. Taxes adjusted. Local leaders empowered instead of overridden. Control loosened. Listening increased. The generals noticed something first, not weakness, but steadiness. The king no longer reacted from insecurity. He paused before decisions, invited counsel again, even welcomed disagreement. Humility restored clarity, and clarity restored confidence, not in himself, but in alignment. Weeks passed. Then one evening, as citizens gathered for prayer in the capital square, the sky shifted. No violent storm, no theatrical lightning, just a gentle wind sweeping through the city. And then, a single drop. Then another. Then rain. Not torrential. Not overwhelming. Sufficient. People lifted their faces upward. Children laughed in the streets. Farmers wept openly in the fields. The king did not rush to the balcony this time. He remained kneeling. Because the rain was not proof of his leadership. It was proof of mercy. Restoration did not erase the memory of drift. It did not rewrite history. The monument still bore its altered inscription as a permanent reminder. Entrusted, not entitled. And that reminder became the new foundation of his reign. He learned what many leaders never do. Success is safest when it feels borrowed. Authority is strongest when it stays surrendered. And blessing is most secure when gratitude outweighs ambition. The kingdom would face challenges again. Drought would return in future seasons. Political tensions would rise. But the throne within his heart had been reclaimed. And that changed everything. Because the greatest victory of his reign was not expansion of territory. It was the quiet, unseen surrender that restored the presence he almost lost. Years later, when historians recorded his reign, they did not begin with the drought. They did not begin with the expansion. They did not even begin with the monument. They began with a single line. He remembered. Because that was the true turning point. Not the rain. Not the public apology. Not the policy reforms. But the moment a powerful man chose surrender over image. The kingdom stabilized. Prosperity returned gradually. The borders remained secure, not because fear enforced them, but because trust strengthened them. And the altered monument stood in the capital square as a quiet warning to future generations. Entrusted, not entitled. Young leaders would ask about it. Elders would tell the story of a king who almost lost everything not through rebellion, but through subtle independence. Of a leader who discovered that God is not threatened by strength, only by pride. And when the king grew old, he often returned to the eastern window, watching light spill across the hills after rain. He no longer asked for greatness. He asked for alignment. Because he understood something that power had once obscured. The real throne was never in the palace. It was always in the heart. And whoever sits there determines the fate of everything else.